Sometime between 1946 and 1947, 3 Bedouin shepherds were exploring the cliffs around the Dead Sea. One of the men threw a rock inside a cave, and he heard the sound of shattering pottery. When they returned a day later, they discovered 10 jars pushed up against the cavern walls. Although most of these jars were empty, 2 contained these cylindrical scrolls. They were so old that they started falling apart in the following days. Although they didn't realize it at the time, they had discovered the first Dead Sea Scrolls. However, only 7 scrolls came from that cave. The Dead Sea Scrolls actually comprise 972 texts. Some of these are complete documents, like the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is a 24-foot-long piece of parchment containing the entire biblical book of Isaiah. Others are tiny, barely legible fragments of papyri. Scholars agree, though, that these scrolls are the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. It has revolutionized both the study of Second Temple Judaism and the New Testament period. However, despite everything we know about the scrolls, we actually don't know who wrote them. The scrolls actually come from 11 different caves, all surrounding the same site called Qumran. Whoever wrote them might have lived at Qumran. In fact, some of the caves can only be accessed by traveling through the site. But what is the evidence for associating the inhabitants of Qumran with the Dead Sea Scrolls? Our first piece of evidence is that Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls date to about the same time period. Although this doesn't prove authorship, it does place them both in the same place at the same time. Based on coins, pottery, and radiocarbon dating, archaeologists have determined that Qumran was inhabited between 100 BCE to about 68 CE when the Romans destroyed Judea. Dating ancient documents, though, is a little bit more difficult, and the Dead Sea Scrolls don't really have any dates printed on any of them. However, scholars do have several methods that allow us to estimate when a document may have been written down. This is called paleography, the study of ancient handwriting. Based on a close analysis of the Hebrew script, scholars have determined whoever wrote them was actually taught somewhere between 225 BCE and 50 CE, under the dynasties of the Hasmonean and Herodian kings. So paleography and archaeology has narrowed the authorship of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the inhabitation of Qumran to the same 200-year time frame. But what can the scrolls themselves tell us about who wrote them? About 40% of the Dead Sea Scrolls are copies of the Hebrew Bible, like the Book of Isaiah and the Book of Psalms. Others are copies of Second Temple literature, like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Tobit. But 30% of the texts are unique, what we call sectarian writings. It is these texts that give us the best idea who might have written the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of these sectarian writings is called the Community Rule. It's essentially a strict manual on how an exclusive community should live in the desert. Some of the rules are pretty strict, like banishing anyone who falls asleep in their assembly for 30 days. But most of the rules focus on purity and food laws, like what we see in the Hebrew Bible. So, if the people living at Qumran actually wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, we would expect to find evidence of ritual purity and communal dining, which is exactly what we find. Qumran has at least 10 ritual purity baths, what we call mikveh, spread throughout the site. The inhabitants here would have periodically immersed themselves in the water to cleanse themselves from any ritual impurity. What is most striking, though, is the sheer size of these mikveh. In fact, the water system at Qumran could hold over 577,000 liters of water, which is over double the amount that a small population in the desert would have needed to survive. They also apparently practice communal dining. Attached to one of the largest rooms in the site, archaeologists discovered a pantry with over 1,000 dishes all stacked on top of each other. Outside of this complex, they discovered a mikveh, where the inhabitants would have ritually purified themselves before entering into the communal dining space. Based on this evidence, scholars agree that a sectarian Jewish community living at Qumran wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls and stored them in the surrounding caves. But can we push this hypothesis even further? Consider, for example, this quote from the Roman historian Pliny the Elder. "Lying on the west of the Dead Sea are the Essenes, a people that live apart from the world. Below this people is the town of En-Gedi. Next, we come to Masada." From the geographical reference points that Pliny the Elder give us, we can assume that there was a sectarian community called the Essenes living north of the cities of En-Gedi and Masada, which puts it in the general region as Qumran. The Essenes were one of the most prominent philosophical schools of Judaism during this time, along with the Sadducees and Pharisees that we read about in the New Testament. Josephus talks about them as a people hyper-concerned with ritual purity, communal dining, and asceticism, which again sounds a lot like the Dead Sea Scrolls theology that we read about. Based on the testimonies of Pliny and Josephus, along with the archaeological material found at Qumran, Scholars hypothesize that not only were the Dead Sea Scrolls written by a small sectarian community, but they were written by the Essenes themselves. This Essene hypothesis has gained considerable popularity in the scholarly community. However, we must remember it's just that, a hypothesis based on evidence. Ancient historians can never be 100% certain when it comes to ancient authorship. Qumran was destroyed in 68 CE when the Romans invaded Judea. Although it's unlikely, some scholars think that the scrolls were hidden in these caves from the Romans as they attacked Qumran. However, we shouldn't think of this as some sad final stand of the Essenes. If they were indeed Essenes, Josephus talks about them in the present tense, implying they survived the invasion. In fact, they accomplished something that people in antiquity never could: long-lasting fame, influence, and a voice heard by millions around the world to this day. If you'd like to know more, you should check out the Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library, run by the Israel Antiquities Authority. Also, the Orion Center's bibliography has a lot of helpful resources for anyone doing research on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe.